On Sunday, 6 November 2022, Cameroon's 89-year-old President Paul Biya marked 40 years in power, becoming one of the world's longest-serving leaders. The nearly 90-year-old autocrat has uninterruptedly ruled Cameroon since being sworn in for the first time on 6 November 1982, following the resignation of the country's first post-independence president, Amadou Ahidjo. After the fall of Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe in 2017, Paul Biya became Africa's oldest president and its longest serving after Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo, who seized power in 1979. Human rights groups have accused him of brazen strongman tactics, including torture and intimidation of his opponents. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the rise to power of Cameroon's strongman Paul Biya and how he has managed to hold on to power for so long. Paul Biya was born in 1933 in the southern Cameroonian village of Mvomeka. His parents were not wealthy, but his small village was a surprising springboard for his accomplishments in life. At 7 years old, his parents sent him to the Catholic mission, which was approximately 50 kilometers from his home. One of Biya's French tutors there found his work as being excellent and determined that the young boy should become a priest. When he was 14 years old, he was admitted to Edia and Akono junior seminaries run by the Center Spirit Catholic Fathers. As for Cameroon itself, the nation was a German colony from 1884 to February 1916, when the Germans were defeated and ousted from the territory during the First World War by joint Anglo-French and Belgian forces. Britain and France decided to divide the country to permit each of them to administer their own territory separately. This meant that the legal, educational, monetary, and even political arrangements were significantly different in the two territories. Meanwhile, young Paul Biya's future was brightened further when he gained admission to the Lycée Le Dere in Yaoundé, Cameroon's capital. Lycée Le Dere was French Cameroon's most prestigious high school. At the Lycée, Paul Biya studied Latin, Greek, and philosophy. His excellent work in secondary school allowed him to study at the University of Paris, where he focused on law and political science. He received his law degree in 1960, and after graduation, Paul lived in France and studied public law at the Institute of Overseas Studies. Meanwhile, the territory administered by France, French Cameroon, got its independence on 1 January 1960 as the Republic of Cameroon. The territories of Cameroon that were administered by Britain, British Southern Cameroon and British Northern Cameroon, which were semi-independent territories administered as part of Nigeria, were to decide through a plebiscite to get their full independence by either joining Nigeria or French Cameroon. British Northern Cameroon voted to join independent Nigeria, while British Southern Cameroon voted to gain independence by joining the already independent Republic of Cameroon. British Southern Cameroon and the Republic of Cameroon agreed on a two-state federation and drew up a federal constitution that effectively guaranteed independent administration of the states under a central federal authority. The federal constitution came into force on 1 October 1961, and the entity became the Federal Republic of Cameroon. Amadou Ahidjo was the first president of the Federal Republic of Cameroon, and his party, the Cameroon National Union, the CNU, won a majority in parliament. So the new federation was born. However, this was a troubled marriage from the onset. In 1972, Amadou Ahidjo changed the federal structure of the country in favor of a unitary state called the United Republic of Cameroon. This was not well received by the people of what was once called British Southern Cameroon, aka the Anglophones. Also at the time, for more than 2 decades as president, Amadou Ahidjo managed to create a system of government that served his vision of the Cameroon nation. This vision was a single-party state with a strong presidential system that virtually gave him complete control of all the state's institutions. President Amadou Ahidjo also built an extensive network of loyalists through a complex patronage system that gave him complete control over the appointment of top administrative and party officials. Consequently, all of them owed their allegiance to him. This was the nation to which Paul Biya returned in 1962 to begin his quiet ascension to the upper echelons of power. When Paul Biya returned to Cameroon, he got a job in the government and was put in charge of the Department of Foreign Development Aid. That position reported directly to President Ahidjo and also gave the young Paul Biya experience in financial management on an international scale. Paul Biya's relationship with the president was a fascinating one, and one that would define his future. Over time, President Ahmadou Ahidjo became Paul Biya's political mentor, and the two became very close. Their backgrounds and even their personalities were very different, however. President Ahidjo had worked as a telephone operator before becoming president, and he had only an elementary school education. Although Paul Biya came from humble beginnings, he was highly educated and enjoyed classical music and tennis. Despite these differences, Paul Biya became a loyal follower of the president. Under President Ahidjo, Paul Biya held a number of positions. He worked as Chief of the Cabinet, Secretary General of the Presidency, and Minister of State, becoming Cameroon's highest-ranking minister. In 1975, Ahmadou Ahidjo chose Paul Biya as Prime Minister, a position he held until 1982. This made Paul Biya President Ahidjo's legal successor. Now, November 6, 1982 is a very significant day in the history of Cameroon, and the events surrounding that day are still debated by historians. On that very day, President Ahidjo, citing health concerns, resigned as president. As was required by the constitution, he handed over the presidency to Paul Biya. The action stunned the nation. Paul Biya was largely unknown to the populace, and he was untried as a head of state. However, Ahmadou Ahidjo's resignation and his retention of the chairmanship of the CNU party made it clear to the public that he intended to rest physically while continuing to rule behind the scenes, with Paul Biya as his rubber stamp in charge of the day-to-day affairs of government. Ahmadou Ahidjo, like many, believed the party head position to be superior to that of president. Since the presidency had become his personal estate, Ahmadou Ahidjo was under the impression that he could return to office after his medical treatment, and his choice of Paul Biya was informed by his belief that Paul Biya was the least ambitious and most docile of his collaborators. He also believed that Paul Biya could be easily controlled even from the hospital bed. As it turned out, both Ahidjo and the people underestimated the quiet and humble Paul Biya. Paul Biya methodically began to assert himself, stamping his image on the nation's life and institutions. He reshuffled the old cabinet in June of 1983, and this action left the former President Ahidjo angered and frustrated because he had not been consulted. In August of 1983, a coup attempt against Paul Biya was seen as an effort by Ahidjo to regain power and influence. This failed coup d'etat resulted in Ahidjo's forced resignation from the party chairmanship and his exile to France. A month after the coup attempt, Paul Biya convened an emergency party congress in Yaoundé and was elected party chairman. Paul Biya then called for a presidential election in January of 1984, 1 year ahead of schedule. He emerged from that election as President of the Republic, leaving behind the stigma of being called Ahidjo's president. But more drama was to ensue in the early days of Paul Biya's presidency. In early 1984, Paul Biya announced that he would soon rotate the Republican Guard in charge of presidential security. The Republican Guard was a paramilitary body that Ahmadou Ahidjo had created to protect himself, and one that was apparently better trained and equipped than the country's armed forces. Most members of the Palace Republican Guard came from Ahidjo's stronghold in the north. Amazingly, after the decree by Paul Biya, the Guard did not voice dissatisfaction with the impending reshuffle. However, a deadly coup occurred in April of 1984 when members of this presidential guard tried to capture the presidential palace. This was on 6 April 1984. On this day, the Republican Guard seized the presidential palace with tanks and heavy fire. They occupied the Yaoundé airport and captured the national radio station, which began playing martial music. The rebels immediately sealed off the army unit responsible for the defense of the capital. However, the rebel leaders misjudged the situation. First, by a trick of radio managers, their broadcast was heard only in Yaoundé and not in the provinces of the country. Secondly, as he was hiding in the palace bunker, President Paul Biya was able to communicate with the armed forces. And so the Yaoundé unit, or those around it, decided to fight for the president rather than join the rebellion. On April 7, after fierce fighting in the capital, the Armed Forces Minister declared the rebels defeated and asked them to surrender. The Republican Guard, however, continued to fight until April 9, when they were completely obliterated. The attempted coup of 1984 was one of the bloodiest yet seen in Africa, causing the death of more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians who were caught in the crossfire. Fortunately for the president, the attempted coup d'etat displeased the overwhelming majority of the Cameroonian people. Cameroonians were full of praise for the country's armed forces. The president's popularity began to soar. Interviewed from exile during the attempted coup, Amadou Ahidjo denied any involvement in the coup d'etat. Nonetheless, the military tribunal implicated him in the plot and sentenced him to death in absentia. But this coup attempt left a psychological mark on poor Biya. Thereafter, unscripted public appearances became a rarity, and when poor Biya's motorcade passed through the streets of the capital, crowds were kept at a distance. Now fully in charge of the nation, Paul Biya moved quickly to revitalize the country's institutions, imposing his image on national life and institutionalize what became known as his New Deal concept for Cameroon. The guidelines of this New Deal policy were political liberalization, rigor and moralization, as well as national integration. This New Deal was intended to bring about a Cameroon that was characterized by a larger degree of individual liberty and freer exchange of ideas, judicious and stringent management of public affairs, transparency and public accountability by government officials, as well as total absence of ethno-regional favoritism. President Paul Biya was seen as a breath of fresh air, and he stepped in saying the right things to different groups. He visited the nation's Anglophone regions, spoke in English, and even referred to Bamenda, a major city in the northwest region, as his second home. It was a marked difference from his predecessor, whose policies severely undermined English as a major part of the nation's bilingualism. And indeed, there was some measure of success during the early part of his rule. As I alluded to, during Ahidjo's administration, a virtual police state had existed in Cameroon, which severely limited political activities, including free speech and opinions, especially if they ran contrary to government policies. Now, President Paul Biya was promising an end to this and many other restrictions. For instance, in 1985, he had introduced a series of measures allowing greater individual and political freedom. More than a dozen privately owned newspapers and magazines popped up in the country, and some of them were highly critical of government policies. Change in Cameroon was not only restricted to the political arena. One of the goals of President Paul Biya's New Deal was to improve the social and economic conditions of the Cameroonian people. With the sale of oil becoming an important source of revenue in the early 1980s, the new president was able to finance many of his New Deal programs, including road construction and subsidizing the prices farmers received for their export crops. The government's commitment to health and educational development of Cameroonians was also evident under the New Deal policy. Between 1984 and 1985, for example, the budget of the Ministry of Health was increased by 32% over that of the previous year. The increase provided additional funds for the construction of new hospitals and clinics in many towns and villages. In March of 1985, Paul Biya revitalized the CNU party during a memorable congress that was held in Bamenda. The party structures were reorganized and the party was renamed the Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, the CPDM. Paul Biya also encouraged his countrymen to develop interest in politics and to freely air out their views. Despite these early successes, however, Cameroonians soon lost faith in the New Deal as the president made a U-turn and started to restrict free speech. He also became reluctant to implement some of the promises he had made. Simultaneously, within 2 years of taking office, Paul Biya made one of his most daring moves when he changed the name of the country to the Republic of Cameroon. The name East Cameroon took when it obtained independence in 1960. Anglophones were furious. Their leaders had neither been consulted nor given any advance warning. As a result, the Anglophones viewed this name change as an attempt to erase their identity and forcefully assimilate them into the majority French system. At the same time, the economic situation in the country started deteriorating. When the price of oil on the world market collapsed, the prices for Cameroon's main crops, cocoa, cotton, coffee and palm oil, also dropped. Beginning in 1987, Cameroon's economy shrunk for 9 consecutive years. In addition, poor economic management had long plagued the country. Cameroonians started placing the blame on Paul Biya, and by the late 1980s, opposition to his government had grown. President Biya admitted that the country faced an economic crisis and the necessity of an IMF structural adjustment program and budget cuts was recognized. The realization that Cameroon had not been able to change the dependent nature of its economy regardless of the economic progress made since independence was a cause of much frustration. Despite the subsequent efforts made towards economic reform, conditions in Cameroon were less than ideal and corruption was rampant. By 1998, Cameroon was classed as the most corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. And in October of 2000, the Catholic Church in Cameroon denounced corruption, saying that corruption had permeated all levels of society. In the late 1980s, a movement was sweeping Africa to allow for multi-party democracies. Against this backdrop, people also started calling for change in the political landscape of Cameroon. And so in 1989, an attorney by the name Yondo Black formed a new major political party, initiating a significant change in the national political climate towards support for a multi-party system in Cameroon. In 1990, Yondo Black and his fellow political organizers were arrested and charged with destabilizing the government and encouraging ethnic tension. In May of that year, spurred by Yondo Black's arrest, another opposition leader, John Frundi, formed a political party called the Social Democratic Front, the SDF. John Frundi, who was a bookshop owner by profession, was to achieve great popularity among the urban masses because of his courage and populist style of leadership. Unfortunately, Paul Biya's government used violent force to break up the SDF's first public rally in Bamenda, and between 4 and 12 people were killed in this rally. In the aftermath, the state-controlled media tried to deny the government's responsibility for this bloody event, and they also started distorting the facts. Anglophone students at the University of Yaoundé, who demonstrated the same day in support of the SDF and political liberalization, were falsely accused by the regime of having marched in favor of the reintegration of Anglophone Cameroon into Nigeria and having sung the national anthem as well as hoisting the Nigerian flag. Leading members of Paul Biya's party strongly condemned the Anglophones for this treacherous action. 1991 was an equally turbulent year in Cameroon. In April, tensions between opposition groups and the government grew. Between April 10 and April 15, 8 pro-democracy demonstrators were killed and several others were wounded. In retaliation, on 25 June, the opposition groups declared a mass general strike across Cameroon under the name Operation Ghost Town. The aim of the operation was to shut down the function of nearly every city in the country. The opposition intended to paralyze the national economy and cut off support for the civil servants of the government. They wanted to end the reign of Paul Biya and to establish democratic procedures for subsequent elections. In response to the strike, the government established operation commanders whose purpose was to re-establish public order. The commanders were sent to 7 of the 10 provinces to exercise control, and for several months the commanders used excessive physical force against the protesters. At the same time, the government began an extensive crackdown on the national press. Paul Biya's administration established the new censorship authority to monitor the content of the press. Independent newspapers were confiscated. In response, on 4 September 1991, dozens of independent journalists staged a peaceful march to protest newspaper bans. Several journalists were injured when security forces confronted them and nearly 40 were detained. By October, however, the strain of the strike began to weigh too heavily on the opposition forces and the strikers of Cameroon. Businesses were unable to endure financially and people were struggling without access to goods and services. The government's ability to maintain at least the image of control during the strike was the main asset that allowed them to wait out the strike. There was no threat of military insubordination, and the government was receiving significant financial support from outside the country. The nation of France retired part of Cameroon's debt and twice arranged for government officials to receive back pay. Additionally, the IMF sent several millions of dollars to the country for economic restructuring. In addition, the government's violent responses to protest, the general feeling that the protests were largely ineffective, and the government's ability to continue functioning led many of the opposition parties to settle for negotiations on Paul Biya's terms. And so in late October, a conference was held and various stakeholders came together with representatives from the government, multiple opposition parties and other parties including media representatives, business interests, religious leaders and workers and students unions. The talks at the conference were restricted to constitutional questions and no reforms were made prior to the elections. Despite these disappointments, in late November, 41 political parties signed an agreement with the government. The SDF was not one of them. By the end of 1991, there were as many as 70 political parties in Cameroon, all of which were representing different interests and resistant to making concessions. The final outcome was decided in presidential elections held in October of 1992. After a campaign rife with intimidation, violence, fraud, and electoral irregularities, Paul Biya won only 40% of the vote, but his two opponents, though gathering between them 55%, split the vote, leaving Biya as being the victor. Even though many people suspected these elections were fraudulent, the president was supported by the former colonial power, France, which continued to be involved in the country through cooperation agreements. France therefore had a big interest in supporting Paul Biya to make sure its economic interests in the country would not be threatened. Eventually, the free resources that stemmed from foreign aid gave Paul Biya the means necessary to ensure his position in office in this time of great political and economic upheaval. Despite the myriad of challenges facing him, Paul Biya managed to hold on to power using underhand maneuvers. His rule was extended with victories in the multi-party elections held in 1997 and 2004. The presidential term had also been extended, first to 5 and then later to 7 years. These elections were marred by irregularities, although the 2004 election experienced fewer problems than the others and was generally viewed as free and fair. In 2007, Paul Biya announced his plan to revise the constitution, where the biggest change was eliminating the limit of 2 presidential mandates. In February of 2008, a popular revolt erupted against this plan. The level of repression was brutal. Hundreds of protesters were killed and thousands were arrested. However, in April of that year, the National Assembly passed a controversial constitutional amendment abolishing presidential term limits, thereby providing Paul Biya with the option to run again in the future, in which he did in the year 2011. In October 2018, Paul Biya won a 7th term in a vote that was marked by low turnout and voter intimidation. President Paul Biya's Achilles heel is the ongoing Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. Since independence, the Anglophones have staged several protests against perceived unfair economic and institutional discrimination, marginalization, and inequality in the appointment of public administrators. This has often caused a periodic outburst of violence, especially when government forces attempt to repress protesters. For instance, in October 2016, lawyers went on strike in an effort to force the government to stop appointing francophone magistrates who spoke no English and had no training in common law to preside over courts in the Anglophone regions. During peaceful demonstrations in the cities of Bamenda and Biya, the lawyers were roughly manhandled by government security forces. Teachers soon came out in support of the lawyers. The teachers wanted the government to stop posting francophone teachers who spoke no English to teach subjects other than French in Anglophone schools. Since then, there have been violent armed confrontations between the secessionist groups and the regular military. The United Nations say that the rebel conflict has killed more than 3,000 people and displaced more than 500,000 since fighting broke out in 2017. Civilians, particularly public service personnel and traditional leaders, are often targeted by both sides. The Anglophone crisis has been a true test of Paul Biya's leadership, and unfortunately, the octogenarian hasn't risen to the occasion, to say the least. Cameroon is in a state of deep crisis. Many commentators and critics say that Paul Biya's extraordinary political longevity can be ascribed to a mixture of astuteness and ruthlessness. Paul Biya has a close-knit group of loyalists who hold key positions and crushes or sidelines opponents and rivals. Many analysts also point to the role that corruption has played in entrenching Paul Biya's regime, with the spoils of this corruption allegedly going to his allies in government, the security forces, and Paul Biya's family. Meanwhile, Paul Biya has also been accused of being the absent president. An organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, in a report in 2018, found that Paul Biya spent at least 4.5 years of his first 35 years in power on private visits abroad, at an estimated cost of more than $65 million. In some years, Paul Biya spent about a third of the year out of his home country. The vast majority of these trips are to Geneva, Switzerland, where Paul Biya frequents the 5-star Intercontinental Hotel, accompanied by his wife and a cabal of up to 50 people, often with government jobs. This is while, according to the United Nations, over 55% of Cameroonians live in poverty, which affects several aspects of their life, from health to education, living conditions, and work, among others. On Sunday, 6 November 2022, President Paul Biya marked 40 years in power, but any talk of who might succeed Paul Biya, who turns 90 in February of 2023, is strictly taboo in government circles and in Cameroon as a whole. Paul Biya looks set to be Cameroon's president for life. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.